Thanks, Martha. So as Martha said, what I'm going to do over the next 25 minutes or so is I'm going to have a look at why I think you might want to work with students to enhance programmes, some different ways in which you can do that, and some things which I think it's really important to pay attention to. So I will be looking particularly in that why through the lens of a programme leader and thinking of things that I think are particularly relevant to you. But before I do that, I want you to think a little bit, first of all, about what do we mean by student-staff partnership? And I think the first quote on the slide there by Alison Cook-Sather, Cathy Bovell and Peter Felton is quite widely used as a definition of staff-student partnership. And they define it as a collaborative, reciprocal process through which all participants have the opportunity to contribute equally, though not necessarily in the same ways, to curricular or pedagogical conceptualisation, decision-making, implementation, investigation or analysis. And I think a lot of people can have trouble with that bit around having the opportunity to contribute equally. And that can be interpreted in different ways in terms of their contribution being equally valued. And I think there is a little bit of clarification there in terms of it's not going to be the same ways as staff necessarily, and what's contributed won't be the same because it will be a slightly different perspective and they'll have different expertise. But nevertheless, I know a lot of people can struggle with the equal participation, particularly in a context where, as a programme leader, you have ultimate responsibility for your programme and for its success. And as Cathy Bovell says in that second quote, actually, many staff and students prefer to talk about striving for meaningful relationships, which may actually fall short of what's considered a true partnership, because perhaps staff and students aren't contributing equally. Nevertheless, so one of the things I do want to do today is give you permission to fall short of true partnership. I think that's fine and to be expected. But nevertheless, we do want to strive towards partnership, I think, and I'm going to give you some reasons why I think that's true, and strive towards all participants having the opportunity to contribute in a meaningful way to programme enhancement. So to think about why that may be relevant to programme leader, I'm going to take you back to what we already know about some of the difficulties for programme leaders. And as Sam Ellis has pointed out, some of the key, I guess, features of the NSS for predicting overall satisfaction and that correlate most with that. So the quality of teaching and students feeling part of a learning community and programme management, those things which correlate with overall satisfaction, they're primarily experienced at the programme level. So they are very much in your realm and your responsibility as programme leaders. And I'll come back in particular to the quality of teaching later, but I want to focus first of all on students feeling part of a learning community. And I think if we've learnt nothing else over the past year during the pandemic, I think we have learnt how important learning communities are. Pretty much every survey that I've seen from students are asking for more social interaction. And they're saying that the greatest challenge for their learning over the last year has been a lack of interaction with staff and with their fellow students. So we know it's important for learning. We know it's important for student satisfaction. I think it's also important for staff satisfaction as well. If we talk to each other, I think some of the things that we've missed is really getting into a classroom and working with students. And there's great fear in teaching and learning circles that there'll be a snap back to how everything was done before. And I think that comes out of that desire to make sure we are building learning communities. And staff-student partnership can help with that. So these first two quotes that I've got on this slide come from students who were working on a project to enhance some practice in their department. It wasn't necessarily on their own programme, but it was within their own department. And what they said was that as a result of working in partnership with staff in their department, they genuinely felt more involved, both with the department and their academic studies. and it enhanced their sense of belonging to their course, which again wasn't necessarily what they were enhancing, but it had that impact of them. And I've worked with students as well who've been reviewing teaching practice with staff. And one of the things which repeatedly came up then was students talked about how much more respect they had for their teachers, having worked in partnership, trying to understand what was happening and the decisions being made. And they said they also gained a far better understanding of some of the constraints in which staff were operating. The staff talked about how they got confirmation that their ideas were worth trying and support from the students that they were working with. So again, it was a learning community being developed here where both the students were benefiting, but the staff were also finding it supportive. So I think that's one reason why we should take student-staff partnerships seriously, and it can benefit us. Another is related to a problem that Heather Fotheringham pointed out, that actually programme leaders get inundated with data. So there's data from the NSS, there's graduate outcomes, there's attainment data, awarding gap data, module evaluations, and the list goes on and on. And from all of that data, it can be quite hard to tell how something's going, because some of the data may indicate it's going well, some may indicate it's going less well. And it becomes really hard to try and prioritise different things and think about what should we really focus on to enhance the programme. And again, I think student-staff partnership can help with that. I'm just going to focus here on the NSS. And we know it's notoriously difficult to interpret this. It may be sometimes that an issue that's raised is just an issue of a particular cohort, so they may not have gelled very well in a certain year. Something may have happened in their first year that's just fed through. And I think working with students can help us to identify, well, does this issue even exist still, or is it something that was just for that cohort? Students can suggest possible solutions. And if we have ideas ourselves, I think they can confirm whether or not our ideas are likely to be successful as well. And Alison Cook-Sather, Kathy Beauvoir and Peter Felton just talk about maybe we should reconceptualise students and just think of them as differently positioned witnesses to what's happening. So we have one view and one perspective of what's happening in our classroom, on our programme, and they have quite a different perspective. And if we bring those together, we can get a far better view of what's actually happening, what the issues are, and how perhaps we can enhance our programmes. So as the other issue that we have in interpreting that data is, as Christine's pointed out, actually we can become disempowered as programme leaders as well by all of this data. If actually we're under pressure to make sure that the enhancements we make are evidence-based, rather than going on our own knowledge of our programme and valuing what we know as programme leaders about what's happening. It may seem strange at first to say that I think student-staff partnership can help with that, but I really think it can, because when you're having discussions in partnership with students, the aim is for it to be equal and power to be shared. And there's not the primacy of the consumer who's telling you, this is what we think, you deliver it, please. There's also not the authority of the academic saying this is just the way it needs to be done, but a real conversation between the two. And I think that gives both students and staff more agency. What perhaps will help clarify that is this quote from Duna Sabri, who highlights really that when you're working in partnership, you can challenge the views of students. You don't need to just take them at face value. So if they're saying, I want a particular practice, you can question, well, is it really going to bring the benefits that you're looking for from it? Even if it is it the best way of doing that? Or is it going to cause difficulties for other students who perhaps are less like you? Because again, as she points out, there is no one single student experience. there's lots of different student experiences which are affected by the context in which students are working, their demographic, whether they're part-time and so on. So we do need to think around, and perhaps particularly if we're just working with a small group of students, we might want to broaden our base of information, perhaps by doing focus groups, again, just to test out our interpretations. So I'm going to move on to different ways in which I think we can work in partnership. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because, as Martha's already said, we've got some case studies coming up after this, which I think will give us even greater ideas of how we can work in partnership. But there's three main ways in which I think we can do that. And the first is by co-designing things with students. So this might be before a module or a programme runs, where we could co-design the syllabus with them, and that might be for a module, for a year of a programme, even the programme itself. We could agree course texts, and there's a big move, I'm told, at the moment towards textbooks. And if you are thinking of moving that way, you might want to think about, could you agree what those texts should be with students? You could co-design some of the learning activities, and I've got an example of that in a minute. Or you could co-design teaching materials and resources with them. So this example of co-designing learning activities comes from Imperial College London, where it was for a first year chemistry course, and they wanted to introduce students very much to the lab. So they gave students different ideas for experiments that could be done on this lab course, gave them the equipment and the materials, and they asked them to test them out. And as the students did that, in collaboration with the staff, they developed some of those experiments far further than the staff initially had intended to do that. At the same time, though, they also removed some of those ideas for experiments. They said they were just too repetitive or they were too difficult for first years. Having established which group of experiments they wanted to use, they then ran focus group with students just to agree the framework for the course and think about which experiments should be done in a group, which ones should be done individually, particularly paying attention to the fact that freeloading's a known challenge in group work. So they discussed that issue with the students. Another way in which I think you could work together with students is negotiating the curriculum. So you may have designed what you're going to do, but with the group of students that you're teaching at a particular time, you might want to negotiate aspects of that. So you could do that by negotiating which case studies you might look at on a module. If students have different essay titles to work on for assignment, or they've got different group projects that they're going to work on, you might negotiate the content that precedes that to prepare for those tasks. And you might do that either by voting for different sessions, or you might negotiate and students suggest different speakers that they'd like to hear. You might ask students, particularly if they're knowledgeable about that subject already, to create slides about what they know about the topic, and then show them at different sessions so that there's a co-delivery of the curriculum. And there can also be co-development of essay titles, or a negotiation of assessment criteria or rubrics where students are working with staff to develop them. So I've got an example which I realise comes from the Scottish context, so some people may know it better than me. But this example is from Queen Mary University, and it occurred on the first year of an environmental justice programme, where the students were mature students and they did know quite a lot about environmental justice because they were all involved in some kind of environmental struggle in their community. So they brought that knowledge with them and contributed it to the programme, and what the staff provided was the conceptual content and the framework of the programme for students to apply their knowledge to. So, for example, one of the students was working on fish farming, and the staff didn't particularly know anything about that, but they helped the student to learn how to do more research into that particular subject and they provided a framework and a lens through which to look at that particular issue. I could hear someone's lost sound. I'm hoping that's just one person.
I can still hear you, Jenny.
You still hear me? I'll keep going then. Okay. So the other way which I think you can do it is in terms of co-reviewing practice. So you may have delivered something and you might want to co-review with students. So I'm going to have a look at a minute of a case study from UCL where teaching practice was reviewed together. You can also audit course materials, and the link that I've got here is for where that was done from an inclusivity perspective. And I think one of our case studies Rashid's going to look at is from that as well. But there are other lenses you could look at. You might look from an international lens. You might look at embedding well-being in the curriculum. So I think there's lots of different ways you could look at it. It's a really rich way of reviewing with students. And I've already talked to some extent about reviewing student evaluations in partnership as well. So this example from UCL is one that I was involved with, where students and staff, first of all, we briefed them together so that they had exactly the same information about what was expected from them. Then they met together to agree a focus for the observations that were going to happen. So staff might say to the students, well, I'd be really interested to hear your observations about this particular aspect. And then the students observed at least 3 hours of teaching. They looked at the VLE, which in this case was Moodle, and they looked at an assignment brief. And during the course of that, the staff and the students were meeting up regularly just to talk about their different perspectives on how these things had gone and what perhaps could be enhanced in future and how to do that. And then the students provided a final report to the staff member as well. So those are some ideas, but I think there are a few things that it's worth paying attention to when you're working in partnership as well. And the top one of those for me is how inclusive you're being in terms of your partnership. So I've already talked about the fact that there are benefits for the students that are involved in terms of feeling part of a learning community, and you want to make sure that opportunity is open to everyone. But the other reason is that students are going to bring perspectives that will create outputs that are going to benefit the students most like them. So again, we want to make sure that the outputs benefit everyone equally, and we're not doing anything to make attainment gaps worse than they may already be. So there's some great ideas in this paper that I've listed here by Lucy Mercer-Mapston, Meisha Islam and Tamara Reid on how to make sure that our practice is inclusive. So some of the ideas you might want to think about is, how can I create a range of opportunities for people to get involved? How can I make those opportunities as flexible as possible? Might want to think about, how do you communicate those chances? If we use the normal communication channels, are we perhaps favouring those who normally come up and engage? And how do we make sure that everyone feels this is for them, that it's not necessarily just for the high achieving students? Because if we get the high achieving students or the people who are most engaged, or then perhaps we're not reaching the students we want to understand why students may struggle, why students may not engage with the material or the programme. And one way of doing that is by having diverse ambassadors or role models as well, and thinking more carefully about how we select participants, because if we're selecting on the basis of high achievement or engagement, then we may be disadvantaging or getting rid of some perspectives that we would find helpful. And finally, we need to think about the recognition that we're giving to students. If we're not paying them, that may be okay if they're getting course credits, but otherwise some students may struggle to find the time to get involved. Another thing which we probably need to think about before we begin working in partnership is, what time do we as staff really have to dedicate to this? And I think the paper, the first quotes from here by Ruth Healy and her colleagues, it's a really interesting paper. What they were doing here was they're redesigning the second year of a curriculum, of their programme curriculum, with a number of staff and students as well. But what they found was that for the staff, they actually found it really hard to prioritise this redesign of the curriculum in the context of the high workloads that they have. So I think we really do need to think about what time do we have before we start working in partnership. And the other thing we need to think about is that students recognise staff are busy. So this second quote is taken from some research that I did with a colleague, Susanna McGowan. And when we spoke to students, they said that they didn't necessarily want to bother staff because they knew that they were busy and they didn't necessarily have the time. So again, how do we make sure we have the time, but then how do we communicate to students that this really is a priority for us and we do want them to come and talk to us if they have any difficulties? Another thing which can be a problem for staff is that working in partnership can cause uncertainty in terms of your role because it's slightly different from normal. So that's particularly going to be the case for anyone new to it. So again, in this example from Ruth Healy and her colleagues, the staff pointed out that they found it really hard when they were responsible for the programme and what was going to be delivered. How could they work equally with students? And that made them feel uncertain to some extent about what they should be doing. And Susanna and I found something similar in our research. It's a slightly different context because we were looking at a student-led project rather than a partnership one. But nevertheless, the staff member who was working with the student said she felt really unsure when the project started to drift off and was no longer going to be of use to the department. She didn't quite know whether she could tell the student that or not. And I think, though it's a slightly different context, it still highlights that when we're focused on the process that we're doing, whether that's partnership or supporting students to do something student-led, we can lose some of our certainty of what we should be doing. So, as I said at the beginning, that's one of the reasons why I think it's okay sometimes to fail in partnership, because we do have to keep an eye on why are we working in partnership? What are we ultimately aiming to do? That role uncertainty can also lead to vulnerability amongst staff, as can actually reviewing practice with students as well. That's another common area where staff tend to report that they feel vulnerable, perhaps a little bit disempowered. And I guess if we're giving that opportunity for students perhaps to challenge what we think and our views, it can lead to that sense of vulnerability because we're used to having the authority. So one of the things I would advocate for that is Martha and her colleagues have suggested establishing institutional programme leadership forums for a whole range of good reasons that's given in this quote here. But I think another useful reason for that is I think it can provide that support network if you do feel vulnerable when working in partnership. And the final thing that I think we need to pay attention to is resistance to partnership. It's fine if it's just you working with a student, perhaps, although students can also be resistant to partnership because they're used to having perhaps a more passive role. So it can be a little bit strange for students too. But my focus here is more if you're trying to engage your colleagues in terms of working in partnership too, because perhaps you're trying to do something a bit wider and having a programme focus, you may experience resistance from them too. And that was what Ruth Healy and her colleagues found. Particularly people who are new to partnership were resistant, particularly when they didn't have support structures in place. So you might want to think about how you can provide the support to any colleagues. A couple of ideas to perhaps deal with that is thinking about the terminology that we use. Do you want to use the term partnership? That can be challenging because of that idea of equality. And terms like collaboration or co-design are perhaps easier for colleagues to sign up to. And you can think about whether you would then want to bring in the language of partnership later. The other thing, and I think all the advice in the literature, is to start small. Perhaps redesigning an entire programme as your first partnership project is not the way to go. And that just makes it easier for other people to get on board and for you to have a success to start with. So in conclusion, I think there are lots of benefits that can come to programme leaders in particular from working in partnership with students. There are quite a few challenges as well, so I want to be upfront about that. But I think if you start small, select a way that's particularly timely for your programme at the moment, and that you make sure you're involving people who have the time to undertake the project and have the commitment to it, then you can be successful in it, particularly if you're ensuring that they have support from you and perhaps any institutional support that's available. And you can grow from a small success. It doesn't have to be a big thing. And I guess my final thought for you is that programme leadership is all about leading without authority. I think you all know that. So if you want to persuade others to get involved, you might want to think about, how do I normally persuade them to do the things I want them to do to enhance my programme? And perhaps you can use those techniques to encourage them to work in partnership with students and with you as well.
Jenny, thank you so much. What a fabulous presentation. You see the virtual claps appearing on the screen. What a clear, practical and engaged presentation. I really appreciate it, but also infused with all those publications, references, papers that we can really go away and read and explore in more detail. So thank you so much for all the thought that's gone into that. We have a few minutes for questions to Jenny on the presentation, if there's anything you want to pick up straight away with her. And then, of course, there will be more time to reflect on this later on in the session as well. So I will open the floor if you either want to put a question into the chat box or put your hands up, and I can bring you into the conversation that way. So please don't be shy. If you've got any questions you want to ask now, then please do so. Elizabeth, I see you put a question there. Would you like to put your mic on and ask that in real life?
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. One of the things I'm wondering about is, would it help if we encouraged our institutions to see these kind of support partnerships as being part of the scholarly activity that we are expected to do? And how do you think we could perhaps encourage staff who are feeling extremely under pressure to see that as a valuable method of scholarship?
It's a really good questions. I think it's a great idea trying to see it as part of the scholarship, and you're right, it is a scholarly activity because you are trying to build your evidence base of why you would be enhancing the programme. I guess in terms of getting people involved, it's always about the recognition that they're going to get, isn't it? You know, it's a reward and recognition. So are they going to get recognised for taking part in this kind of work? And I have seen it where if it's valued by an institution, and it's far easier where it's valued by an institution, then it starts getting recognised in things like promotion, as in you're taking part in this. Otherwise, if it's not, then I think you probably, if you want to persuade others to get involved, you might want to think about, are there ways in which we can get publications out of this, which might be, and perhaps multiple publications. So it could be around the process and what you've learned from doing that. It could be around the actual outcomes as well, and what have we learned about the programme, and perhaps that gives people the permission to invest the time, which, as I said, I think is a challenge actually.
Thank you.
Really interesting thoughts. I think there's probably more that we can think together about on that.
I'd be interested to. Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Super, thank you. Louise, would you like to come in, as you've got a couple of questions in the chat there?
Hi, morning Martha, morning everyone, and thanks for a great presentation, Jennifer. My question relates to the kind of perennial problem of having a great engaging student cohort one year and maybe not so great the next year. Any tips of how we might effectively kind of continue that momentum then?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Because it does vary with cohorts. I guess some of it's around thinking how, if you've had a engaged cohort the previous year, it's slightly tricky because they perhaps can't tell you so much about why the others aren't engaged if they themselves are. So it's not necessarily drawing on their perspective so much, but perhaps if we can draw on them as role models and what they've gained out of working in partnership, and perhaps what they've learned and benefited from engaging with you, and drawing on that. But as I said, it is slightly tricky, that one, because I don't think they can tell you that much about. I've worked actually with students trying to understand from them why other students might not be engaged, and actually what I learned from that was it's not necessarily that helpful.
You're still on mute, Louise.
Yeah, my second question was more of a comment about, you talked about reward and recognition, and yeah, I just remembered that pre-pandemic, we didn't do it last year, we had course awards to recognize student nominated and staff nominated course awards to look at these. So maybe that's something to think about for other institutions.
Sounds like a great idea, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Louise. And there's other questions and comments coming into the chat. So please do keep those coming through, and we can pick those up in our wider conversation. I guess one of the things I was really struck by, and would love to pick up later on in the informal conversation, is how the experience of the last year might have brought us some new ways of engaging and a new kind of immediacy of engagement with our students that we might want to hang on to. So I guess that's something for you to ponder, Jenny, but also for colleagues in the discussion. I'd love to hear what you want to hold on to, and if there's things that we've learned this year that we might want to take forward for the longer term. But for now, Jenny, thank you so much for your presentation, and we're going to now turn to two snapshots of practice from other colleagues. So I'm going to first turn to Rashid Aziz, who is Programme Director in Criminology at London South Bank University. So Rashid, hopefully the technology will work and we will have your presentation. So thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Hello, thank you for having me. That was a really interesting presentation there. I really enjoyed it. Can you see my slides? Just so
can indeed. That's perfect.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I've titled this Beyond Module Feedback because one of the problems that we were having at London South Bank University is that module feedback wasn't giving us much information about anything that we really wanted to know about, such as assessment and feedback, for example, and what students really felt about the programme. That was for a number of reasons. Engagement with module feedback was very low, especially since we did it online rather than using physical hard copies of module evaluation forms. And it wasn't really something, and if the students didn't do it, then we didn't get, obviously, the data, but it was often difficult to know what to ask in those as well. So over the last few years, I've been at South Bank since 2017, and over the last few years, I've been working on a few projects that have come out, that have emerged for different reasons, and those are ones that I wanted to talk about today very briefly. So the first project is on assessment and feedback. There's another project which we completed last year on the racial awarding gap, and thirdly, one that we are in the middle of doing at the moment on decolonizing the curriculum. Now, all three of these projects involved interviews or focus groups with current students in the School of Law and Social Sciences at London South Bank. The Racial Awarding Gap project and the Decolonising the Curriculum project also utilised school-wide surveys as well. And I'm just going to talk about these projects in a little bit more detail now. So the Assessment and Feedback project actually came out of trying to improve the NSS or the NSS scores. because this was an area in which we didn't do as well as we might have. So we used to rely on module feedback and individual modules to improve on assessment and feedback practices, but that wasn't working. So what we did is we conducted a project looking at assessment and feedback across the board. So we interviewed and did focus groups with students from all 3 year groups, and this led to a number of changes in the way that we assess and the way that we give feedback. This happened alongside a shift in the university as well, who were looking at assessment and feedback, and this informed that discussion too. So, and I don't want to go through all of the recommendations and all of the findings because I don't want to be here forever. I don't think you want to either. But one of the things that, looking back at this project, one of the things that was recommended, the last point on the slide here, is introduce the use of online video software as an alternative to face-to-face office hours. And I just found that somewhat amusing, given 3 or 4 years after this project happened, we were kind of forced into that, and it's something that we are discussing keeping going forward. So doing things like office hours, project supervision online, rather than having students come to our offices to do them, because students have commented that these have been very useful and they would be useful going forward as well. The next project that we worked on just as we went into lockdown, this survey went live, is on the racial awarding gap. Now, the racial awarding gap is defined as the measurement of the difference in educational outcomes between white and BAME students, and there's growing evidence that this exists in higher education. I think nationally it's around 13%, so essentially BAME students are less likely to get a first class or upper second class honours degree than white students. And this was particularly relevant in the School of Law and Social Sciences where I work, which had the largest attainment gap in the university, 23% in 2017, 22% in 2018, 20% in 2019. It was coming down slightly, but it was still above what was the university average as well as the sector average as well. So this was something, and a little bit of context, that LSBU is a majority BAME university, where 60% of the students at LSBU, around 60% of the students at LSBU are from a BAME background. So this was something that we felt we really needed to investigate and we really needed to get involved with. One of the first things that we did actually when looking at the racial awarding gap, because this was started off in my division by myself and one of my colleagues, is we went to the institution. So we got the directors for education and student experience in the room. We got people from the Centre for Research Informed Teaching in the room, and we said that this should be an institutional responsibility rather than just a responsibility of the program leaders or the program directors. This needs to be an institutional responsibility. So off the back of that, there was funding made available by the institution to conduct projects like these, which we were able to do. So this project started around the time that we first went into lockdown, so in March 2020. So we took the opportunity then as well to ask students about COVID and the effect that it might have on their education. Some of the stuff that we found, or some of the things that we found, was that BAME students were more likely to be carers than their white counterparts. So caring for children or caring for other relatives. They were less likely to have access to technology, so were really impacted by the move into lockdown, especially at the end of that academic year when all the libraries closed and they couldn't get their work done. They were more likely to be in full-time employment as well, so therefore less likely to engage with lectures and seminars than other students. But at the same time were less likely to ask for help from tutors, lecturers and tutors as well. We asked questions about race and racism at university, and we found that 20% of BAME students were uncomfortable discussing race and racism, which we found rather fascinating, given that we're a School of Law and Social Sciences, and we discuss race a lot, especially within criminology and sociology. And most of the students weren't aware that there was a racial awarding gap at all. And this was the first time that they were hearing about it. So this emerged from both the interviews and the surveys, and we came up with a number of recommendations. And I've put some of them on the slides here. There were more than this as well, but essentially we were asking for more support for BAME students, which essentially translates to more support for all students for access to technology, especially during the pandemic. Luckily, the university already made that available. There was a fund available, a technology fund that students could access. And we asked the university to think about supporting BAME students, supporting students in their roles as carers, and considering the impact that caring has on a student's ability to participate. So some of the things that we're doing at the moment, we could carry forward, for example. So we weren't recording lectures at all before. We weren't having online seminars at all before. Some of the things that we're doing now that we've moved onto a hybrid style of learning, we could carry forward. We also made recommendations on how to report racism and microaggressions, and to provide staff with training on microaggressions and unwitting racism. And finally, the project that we're working on at the moment is on decolonising the curriculum. Again, this comes from the same pot of money that the racial awarding gap project came from, and this was a follow-up to that. One of the hot topics or key topics at the moment is on decolonising the curriculum. And one of the things that we thought was that, well, what does it mean? I think there's quite a lot of work at the moment coming out on this, both in the media and in academia, but I think it's hard to pinpoint one definition. And if it's hard for us to do that, it must be even more difficult for students to do that. So what we're really interested in is to listen to the student voice again about decolonising the curriculum. What does it mean to students? And will it make a difference to students going forward? So this project is we're just about to launch the survey. We've just loaded it up, about to launch the survey and send it out to students. And after that, we will do focus groups and interviews as well. But one of the things that we want to emerge out of these two projects is a resource site for students and for staff, both internal and external, to be able to decolonise the curriculum and combat the racial awarding gap. That's all from me. So thank you very much.
Rashid, thank you so much. I mean, each one of those projects could have been a keynote presentation in itself. There's so much that we could pick up on and explore. Absolutely fascinating about the racial awarding gap. I think is just fascinating to see that extent, and to hear a little bit more about what you've done in that space would be wonderful. I'm going to ask colleagues to either put your comments and questions into the chat while we hear our second snapshot of practice, and that will give Rashid a bit of a chance to have a breather, look at your comments and questions, and respond in the tea break conversation afterwards. So I'm going to say thank you so much to Rashid, and now move on to ask Christine Haddow and Susan Meldrum from Edinburgh Napier University to give us a snapshot of their practice leading an inter-programme initiative. So I'm going to hand over to you, Christine and Susan.
Thank you, Martha. Can I just check that you can hear me and see my slides?
We can hear you and we can see your slides perfectly. Thank you.
Great, that's perfect. Thank you very much for the presentations that have gone so far. It's really interesting to hear different perspectives on engaging with the student body in different contexts to enhance programmes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that Susan and I recently completed with students in our subject group. We're both within the social sciences subject group at Edinburgh Napier. As Martha mentioned, I'm the programme leader for the criminology programme, and Susan is programme leader for our postgraduate diploma in career guidance and development. And we're going to share a bit of information and some learning from a peer mentoring scheme that we set up between the suite of undergraduate programmes we have in our subject group and the postgraduate diploma in career guidance students. So mentoring itself is something that's gained purchase in higher education as a means of supporting students in their learning. There are a number of different definitions and ways that we might understand mentoring, and it's used in a lot of different contexts. So for example, in supporting first year students with the transition to university, and it's something that I remember myself when I started my undergraduate degree. I had a mentor at that time, so it was really interesting to be able to put that sort of relationship in place for our students now. In the context of employability, which is the area that we were working in, mentors are often professionals. So there are examples of this, for example, the Sterling Employability e-mentoring project set up alumni graduates in relevant employment sectors to mentor their third year undergrad students. And there are a lot of positive outcomes evidenced in the literature from this type of scheme. So studies have found, for example, that they build self-confidence and enhance employability skills, and that they help students to develop supportive networks. There are also some tensions or key issues to think about when you're setting something up like this. So one question is, how formalised do we want that mentoring to be? The relationships can develop organically. Some of us might have identified a mentor in our own careers over time, or they can be set up in a more structured way through a formalised process, which is more along the lines of what we did. And it's also quite important to clarify the role of the mentor. So it's important to have clear expectations for mentees and clear boundaries set up as to what is going to take place within that relationship. So in terms of the project that Susan and I have recently completed, one of the things that brought us together to work on this is that Susan and I are employability leads within our subject group. So we're always thinking about what we can do to support students in that area. And it was in part prompted by some feedback that I collected with our fourth year undergraduate students. Similarly, this sort of stuff isn't really captured within our module surveys and the sort of normal feedback that we collect throughout the year. So I collected some feedback with the students in induction and identified areas that they would like a little bit more support with. And career goal setting was a particular area that they identified, which is probably not surprising within criminology and social sciences and even our policing degree. There's not necessarily one vocation that each programme leads directly into, and they might want to pursue other options. So one of the things students were saying is they were just a bit overwhelmed by the range of things that they could pursue. So the work was definitely prompted by the student voice in that sense. And for our career guidance students, they're undertaking a professional qualification to prepare for a career in that area. So they benefit hugely from gaining a wide range of hands-on experience in guidance and coaching and mentoring. And at the same time, there was also school level emphasis on the graduate outcome survey and trying to improve some of our statistics there, some of the outcomes that we were seeing for graduates around sort of professional and managerial employment after graduation. So it all falls within the definition of mentoring that I had on the previous slide, whereby it met the development needs of both the mentees and the mentors to help them fulfil their potential. And in doing so also benefited the university. In terms of what we actually did, we set up a virtual mentoring scheme via WebEx between our postgraduate and undergraduate students. So our career guidance students acted as mentors for our undergraduate students. The scheme was open to students from 3 programmes within our subject group, so criminology, policing and social sciences. And we provided the students who were going to be graduating fairly soon, so 3rd and 4th year students. And all we really did was email out to the students to make them aware of the scheme. Susan prepared a short video presentation to give them a bit of insight into what it would involve. And we gave them a deadline to express interest by. And we then matched up the students with a mentor. Because of the level of interest from the undergraduate students, some of our career guidance students actually ended up with 2 mentees. And we had 25 undergraduate students in total paired with a career guidance mentor. We then facilitated an online introduction session. So Susan and I, with support from Emma from our Student Futures team, explained a little bit about the scheme and its aims. And then we really tried to clarify the role of the mentor and set those boundaries that I just mentioned are very important. And we didn't want it to become obviously too onerous for career guidance students in particular. So our guidance was that the students would have a 1-hour session between February and April, and this could be a minimum of 1 session, or we said a maximum of 4 in total. And we know from the feedback that most students chose to meet more than once. And we then sent the students off into breakout rooms with their mentors and to start basically making arrangements to meet as and when it suit them. And this, again, was all really to happen virtually, obviously, during the context of online learning and the pandemic. So beyond that, we really allowed the relationship to develop as the mentee and the mentor wanted it to. There were no other facilitated sessions by us. So although it was a formalised scheme, we really allowed that to develop organically. So I'm now going to hand over to Susan, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the outcomes of that.
Okay, thank you, Christine. And as Christine was saying, I'm Susan Meldrum. I'm just checking, first of all, you can hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can indeed,
that's
Susan.
Great, that's great, yeah, just conscious I hadn't spoken yet, so that's great. Okay, so in terms of the outcomes then, there was a number of benefits basically that were what we got from the scheme that we were able to identify. So basically we gathered feedback from both the undergraduate students and the postgraduate students that took part in the programme. In terms of the undergraduate students, there was a number of different benefits there. So what they were talking about was, there seemed to be a theme that the students, I suppose it was related to the goals. There seemed to be a lot clearer about the goals that they were aiming towards, what sort of jobs they wanted to go into, what sort of postgraduate options they wanted to go into. So there was more of an insight related to that. Also related to that, there seemed to be a recognition that it did increase their confidence level. So having a chance to, because they were both students, that it was peer-to-peer, there seemed to be a recognition it was a more equal interaction that was taking place. And also our Student Futures, which is the career service for the University of Edinburgh Napier, it seemed to bring up the recognition that there was more support available. So I suppose bringing on what other support going forward from the mentoring relationship that the undergraduate students were able to go for from that. In terms of the postgraduate career guidance students that were the mentors, so the mentors talked about they were interested, as it was said, they were interested in gaining the experience of picking up professional level experience in career guidance, mentoring and coaching. So they did comment from the feedback that they were able to develop the professional skills as a result of the mentoring. And they also talked about, again, as it was peer-to-peer, student to student, they did seem to appreciate it was a bit less formal than some of the interactions that they had been used to taking part with in the programme. So giving them a chance, because they were speaking to their mentees on a number of occasions, they appreciated that semi-formal relationship. There were a number of improvements that were identified from the feedback. One of the things that was picked up from it was that in relation to the undergraduate students, they did comment about maybe, I suppose, the expectations been made a bit clearer. That, for example, some of the undergraduate students were kind of commenting that I think they expected the career kindness students to tell them what to do with their life. So that is something that can be quite common with that kind of relationship in terms of careers advice. So maybe, like, I suppose, clarifying that what the mentee can and can't do, making that a bit clearer is something that we could look at going forward. Finally, in terms of the next steps, what we will be looking at in terms of going forward with this, very keen for it to take place in future years, look at how we could develop it in terms of involving other students. Could we involve a wider range of undergraduate students? Could we get other programme leaders involved in this kind of programme? Maybe, for example, speak to the business school and hook up some of the undergraduate business administration students with the human resource postgraduate students, for example. So there's a number of ways that we could take this forward. Okay, so thank you very much.